Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Next is our session titled Our Fermented Lives, the Global History of Fermentation with Julia Skinner. And we're so excited. Thank you for being here. My name is Cindy Goodner, and I'm the Development Director at Seed Savers Exchange. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge our community agreements. Yes, to be patient, to speak from your own experiences, to try to avoid jargon, to be conscious of intent versus impact, to take space and make space, and to take care of self. And I would also like to thank our lead sponsor. Thank you to Rancho Gordo for sponsoring this session. Rancho Gordo is a specialty producer and seller of heirloom beans based in Napa County, California. Founder Steve Sando traveled throughout the Americas searching for unique and rare legumes and herbs. Each summer, he'd grow them to see if they'd be suitable for production or just seed saving. Rancho Gordo shares seeds via the Seed Savers Exchange and encourages anyone to give growing beans a go. It's easy, fun, and the rewards are almost immediate. And today, we're here with Julia Skinner. Hi, Julia.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Of course. Julia Skinner, PhD, is an award-winning food writer and the owner of Root, a culinary business, as well as a writing coach, a fermentation educator, and a food historian. Her latest book, Our Fermented Lives, won a silver Nautilus medal and earned her finalist honors for both Georgia Author of the Year and the IACP Cookbook Awards. Julia is currently working on her next two books, the Essential Food Preserving Handbook and the Magic of Fermentation, to be published by Storey. Today, Julia will be talking about fermentation. Fermentation has influenced our lives and diets in many different ways throughout history. This session will explore fermented foods and their intersection with preserving health, flavor, and community. Julia, thanks so much for being here.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. And it's wonderful to be here and to talk a little bit about the magic of fermentation with everyone today.
I'm so excited to learn, and I know our community is too. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
Oh, well, thank you. So I, as she mentioned, I'm the author of Our Fermented Lives, this lovely book right here. And today we're going to be talking about the wonderful things I talk about in here, the history of fermentation, right? So I'm going to give you a bird's eye view into that history and how it's shaped our cultures and our communities, using some of the same themes that I discuss in the book, kind of as a grounding point, and then I'll save time for questions at the end as well. And I hope you'll leave with some fun new facts and kind of, some like cool things that you now know about fermentation. But also, I hope you leave with a deepened appreciation for this diverse, global, wonderful craft and its intersections with our own lives and histories. Fermentation has shaped our lives and our communities for millennia, and it intersects with our health, our history, and all kinds of good stuff. So I want to start by saying, what is fermentation, right? So when I say fermentation, you might think of the famous quote from Sandor Katz, which is the transformative action of microbes. And I really like this quote because it encompasses some of the variety of what we mean when we talk about fermentation, because it's so many different processes, right? But what exactly does that mean? So, or what exactly are fermented foods? So I have a few examples here that you may be able to see in my messy office here. We have this jar of kimchi, right? So this is lacto-fermented. This is some pickling starter. I use this in my pickles. We have some pine needle vinegar. And so vinegar's fermented. That's a 2-step process. So alcohol, just a bottle of whiskey here. That's also fermented and then distilled. All alcohol is fermented. And then if you want to make vinegar, then you ferment it a second time into vinegar. Lacto-fermentation is a single-step process. Some other stuff, we have some carrot pickles here. This pickle brine I've actually brought with me every time I've traveled for the past 5 years. Every trip I've gone on, this pickle brine has come with me. So it's very pungent. We have infused vinegars, right? So the vinegar itself is fermented. This is for an elderflower cordial. The recipe is in my next book, The Magic of Fermentation. And these are actually elderflowers from the edge of the ravine next to my house. And then, other things too. I mean, like sourdough starter, for example, miso paste, coffee, vanilla, chocolate, soy sauce, beer, all kinds of things, right? And you probably have some favorites and maybe some you didn't know were fermented. So when I talk about fermentation, I think that discussion of transformation and the centrality of the microbes is a really important point. And the way that those microbes interact with our food really changes the base product into something new and something magical and something really cool. Ferments are a part of every single culture in the world, as well as many areas of our lives. So in Our Fermented Lives, I consider fermentation through the lens of some of those different ways of thinking about fermentation, and so we're going to go through those. So my first chapter in here is called Ferments for Life. So what on earth does that mean? So talking about fermentation means going way back to the beginning, right? So we evolved from microbes, right? Later co-evolving with them. That's why we have a microbiome. To become hosts for the ones who are beneficial for us, and that ferment our food and keep our bodies healthy. We learn more all the time about the ways that is the case. Later on, we learned how to intentionally harness the power of fermentation to preserve our food, help keep it safe, and to nourish ourselves. And across the world, ferments support our health, strengthen our communities, flavor our food, and also help us preserve our food. So we don't know who or when intentional fermentation by humans started, right? We know that the process of fermentation predates us, right? Microbes breaking down things in the environment and transforming them is, as old as time itself. But when we started doing it, we are guessing that it might have coincided with the agricultural revolution. But, one of the problems with doing this kind of research is that you don't have the archaeological remains necessarily to be able to tell. Like we don't have like a jug that's like, this is the oldest jug that had sauerkraut in it or something, right? Like a lot of people were fermenting things in biodegradable containers, which means that information is now lost. So why do we guess the start of the agricultural revolution? So in part, it's because we had, I wouldn't say more food, but we kind of had more control over our food supply, right? And so maybe had more of a need to preserve it. But also we weren't moving around as much, right? People are starting to settle in communities. If you think about, if I'm fermenting, let's say I gather up a bunch of seawater and I start using it to pickle some vegetables, or, whatever, I start making some beer, or whatever it is I'm making, fermenting dairy. And then suddenly, I have to like pick up this big sloshy thing, with all this brine in it and haul it to the next place I'm going. That's not necessarily very practical. I've done it. I wouldn't recommend doing it, but I have done it. I've moved cross country with lots of ferments, and it's a little intense. So I would definitely recommend not doing that. But that is part of why we think that it coincided with people settling in communities and moving away from a nomadic lifestyle. So, fermentation, part of what is powerful to me about this is that it's found in every single community. So, ancient practices of fermentation exist across the globe, right? And so people were discovering and harnessing this power at the same time, even when they weren't communicating with each other about it, right? So yeah, I have in my notes here this way that I feel about fermentation that might resonate with some of you, which is to ferment is to engage in a practice that feels both otherworldly and rooted within our own world all at once. And our ancestors felt the same way. So ferments are connected to various myths and religious traditions as well. And I don't want to get like too far off on this tangent, but I think it's interesting because it shows us how central and important ferments were and are, right, to different cultures and communities. So either the ferments were consumed as a part of religious rituals, or there was actual gods and other, beings associated with fermentation that were worshipped as a part of various religions. So a few examples would be Ninkasi, the goddess of brewing in Sumeria. In the Vikings, we have the mead of poetry and inspiration. In Celtic Wales, we have Caradwyn's brew of knowledge and inspiration. So we've got, and there's tons of other examples too, but those are the three that I'm most familiar with. So kind of an interesting way that it shows the ways that this has been very important for us. So another way that fermentation has been very important is preservation, right? Actual food preservation. As I'm sure everybody here is aware, for most of human history, we've not had access to the variety of year-round foods that we're used to now, right? That is a pretty recent phenomenon. So eating in season and preserving food for later have long been two critical components of food security. And around the world, fermentation has been a really critical part of our larger efforts towards food security and food preservation. So fermentation preserves food in a variety of ways, depending on the type of ferment. So, for example, when we look at our kimchi back here, our bacteria are acidifying the brine, which prevents spoilage, and because it crowds out and creates a selective environment for the good microbes, and it crowds out and does not create a selective environment for the pathogenic microbes, right? Or we might have turning grapes into wine rather than letting them rot, right? Like alcohol is it's going to have more shelf stability than the fruit, which, will naturally turn to alcohol, but also could potentially rot in the process, depending on it's the environment it's in. So fermentation allows us to enjoy and receive needed nutrients from our fruits and vegetables and other foods. We have dairy fermentation, for example, so that gives us protein and calcium and all of these important nutrients, even out of season. So another way that fermentation helps us with food preservation is in cutting down on food waste. So when we use every part of our food that we can, we honor that food and we honor the labor that went into it. All of the hands that touched that food on its journey to our plate, when we actually take the time and the dedicated effort to use every part of that particular ingredient. And fermentation gives us some creative ways to play with that. So earlier today in my kitchen, I was making beet kvass. So I made a bunch of food with beets, and I had like little tops and ends, and I, sometimes I make stock out of them, or I, do other stuff with them. But this time I just put them in some salt and some water in a jar. In a couple days, I'll have beet kvass that I can drink, or I'll use to pickle eggs in, which is also very good if you're a pickled egg person. So fermentation is a really important tool in your, kind of toolbox of low waste ways of cooking. You can infuse scraps in vinegar. You can shred up, those bits from the beets. You could also grate those up and put them in, say, like sauerkraut or something like that. You can use them to flavor mead or beer. There's a lot of different stuff you can do. So it's, we are able to preserve our food both as a standalone ingredient and then also reduce food waste. So both very good things that fermentation does for us. Fermentation also gives us so much wonderful so many wonderful possibilities to explore with flavor. So we get the tangy bite from sauerkraut, we get the zing from vinegar, we get the deep umami from soy sauce. So I was excited when we mentioned beans at the start of this. I love Rancho Gordo, but I also I love beans in general because you use them in some really wonderful, flavorful ferments. So soy sauce and miso, for example, are bean-based, right? And you can make versions of them, or tempeh. You can make versions of them using all kinds of different beans. My favorite tempeh that I make is one actually made with black-eyed peas rather than soybeans. Super, super good. If you've never made that before, I highly recommend it. So we have all of these different flavor possibilities, right? Fermentation really brings out a lot of really good flavors. And because we're working with microbial communities, different community members will bring out different flavors in our foods. So Acetobacter ferments alcohol into vinegar, for example. But perhaps the wild yeast that you use to brew that alcohol, if you did a wild fermentation on it, add some funky, maybe some savory flavors. So there's potentially some more depth there. So instead of a one-dimensional flavor profile, suddenly you're invited to experience something that's complex and delicious and that asks your palate to kind of feel its way across all these flavor possibilities rather than just kind of this one monotone experience. And of course, our ancestors knew this too, right? This is why we have so many different flavorful ferments that are used as seasonings and used, as condiments. People throughout history were as creative in the kitchen as we are today, and built these flavorful dishes that made their ingredients sing using what was available to them. And those dishes also changed over time, and the flavor of them changed over time as communities, human communities, interacted, moved things around, were introduced to new ingredients. So kimchi is a good example. Kimchi has been around for at least 2,500 years, maybe longer. And initially it was mostly cabbage and radish, right? Because hot peppers weren't actually introduced until much later. The first mention that I know of in Korea is actually in 1715, so way after people started making kimchi. After that time is when they started being incorporated into kimchi, but not into every kind of kimchi. Like, there's so many different kinds of kimchi, hundreds and hundreds of varieties. But oftentimes to us, with our Western palates, we associate kimchi with a spicy flavor. So that is from those hot peppers that are, in the history of kimchi, a relatively recent addition. So people in the past, of course, ate as diverse of diets as they could and tried to fold in plenty of flavor throughout their dishes, and fermentation was a part of that. So a couple examples are garum, which is Roman fish sauce. Also, of course, fish sauces in all of the places they appear in Eastern and Southeastern Asia. These help you stretch your supply of salt, but also add a really deep, complex flavor. Rice wine vinegar is not only used to pickle and preserve, of course, but also a seasoning that adds a lot of tang to all kinds of different dishes, including even to rice, right? To add a little bit of depth and interest there. And while fermenting vegetables helps us preserve them for longer and gives us, again, those important nutrients, that also brings us a lot of good flavors. So again, our kimchi, I keep talking about my beautiful kimchi. It's almost ready and I'm very excited to eat it in like a week. So, so I want to talk briefly about lactofermentation of vegetables, because that's one of the things I get asked about a lot. And I imagine will probably come up in the questions. And so as we're talking about flavor, let's talk about lactofermentation. So lactofermentation happens in a brine of about 2 to 5% salinity. So if you're cooking along at home, that's like 1 to 2 tablespoons of salt per quart, roughly, right? We've got a range here. Per quart of water, sorry. And then mix that up. You want to use room temperature water. You dump it over your vegetables until they're completely covered. And then you let it ferment. When it tastes the way you want, it's done. Put it in the fridge. That's, yeah, I mean, I'm happy to answer more questions about it, but it really, really is very easy. We have been salting our food. So, kind of this in history, we've been salting our food since the Neolithic period. We don't know, again, when brine fermentation began. What we suspect happened is our ancestors likely packed excess crops in salt water during or after the advent of agriculture, or maybe they packed them in salt and something got rained on, right? We've got a few possibilities. So that's probably where that came from initially. Maybe someday we'll know for sure, maybe not. We can mimic that flavor with quick pickles, which I'm sure many people here have made quick pickles. But basically, the reason they're called quick pickles is that instead of fermenting and having the bacteria acidify the brine over a period of days or weeks, you are quickly making an acidic brine by adding vinegar. So, quick pickles. So ferments. Let's move on to the next chapter of our book here. So ferments for health is one I found very interesting. For thousands of years, fermented foods have been an important part of traditional medical systems. So part of the reason for that is that flavor is an important part of many of these systems, and they typically offer highly individualized advice based on one person's health and their constitution, and how that constitution is described in a certain framework, like humoral theory, Ayurveda, Chinese medicine, with a focus on using this overarching guidance that brings balance to the body. So in humoral medicine, for example, sour flavors are considered dry and warming, and so are used to balance cool, moist foods like pork or fish. And it's actually interesting because that balance is at the root of some of our popular flavor combinations today, still here in the West, like lemon and fish, or prepared mustard and pork. Those actually are rooted in these flavor combinations from humoral medicine. Sour foods would be also recommended for people with phlegmatic temperaments to help balance their bodies. Things are slow and sluggish and cold, and so we're trying to kind of heat them up and get them moving. Traditional medical systems also had dietary advice that was seasonal. And so in Chinese medicine, for example, sour food was recommended in the springtime. Again, we're kind of have this like waking up your body sort of thing after the cold winter. And of course, today we're learning more and more about other ways that the fermented foods in our lives impact our bodies. So our microbiomes, right? We're learning a ton about our microbiomes and about the different ways that prebiotic and probiotic and postbiotic foods interact with our bodies. Now, what do those things mean? Prebiotic food is fibers that your microbiome can feed on. So dietary fiber, right? Probiotic food is food that's got live and active cultures. Excuse me. Postbiotic food is food that is maybe the microbes in it are no longer alive, but it still supports your microbiome. And we're learning that the microbes don't have to be alive to inform your microbiome. It's something I'm still reading about and I'm not super familiar with, but I think it's super cool and I'm excited to see where that research goes in the future. So we know, for example, that our microbiome plays an important part in our immune system. Of course, I think that's probably the most famous way that many of us know about it. And obviously our digestion, right? A lot of it exists in our gut. But we're also learning it influences our mood, our nervous system, all kinds of stuff. It's pretty central to our health. So something very cool that is a very active area of research right now, and something I'm very excited to learn more about, as I'm sure you are too, as time goes on. And so this kind of leads me to this last point that I have about ferments for community. So with fermentation, cooking is always a collaboration. We're working together with a community. Maybe when we can't see, right? We can't see our microbes in here, but they're in there. But we're working with that community to transform our food into something new. Often it works. Once in a while it doesn't work. But we always learn something new when we do it, right? As part of this collaboration. And it's, I love that it's kind of a reminder that you're never cooking alone. You always have these microbes here helping you, and you're helping them. But fermentation strengthens our human communities as well. So I talked about food waste, and it helps us repurpose food that might be wasted so that we can use it to feed ourselves and others. It gives us a chance to flex our creative muscles in the kitchen and then share what we make with people we care about. And it gives us the chance to strengthen our connections to each other in real time. So there's a lot of long traditions of making ferments in groups. Harvest season festivals, things like that being a good example. If you're familiar with kimjang, the Korean kimchi making parties, that's another. Families and community members come together to preserve food during harvest season, and then that feeds them throughout the winter. So what's happening is we're supporting our community in two different ways. So as we prepare our food, we're coming together, we're talking, we're sharing stories, we're learning from each other, and we're catching up with our friends and neighbors, and strengthening our community in that way. But then we're strengthening our community in the future too, by enhancing our food security, making sure everybody's got something to eat. So, strengthening our community by making sure, we literally eat and stay alive. So it also, it strengthens those community bonds I already talked about, but it also allows us to pass on cultural knowledge and supports community resilience, both through that knowledge and through actually having the fermented foods there to support our health and to preserve our ingredients. So I wrapped up the book talking about ferments for the future. And so we've got the health research I mentioned, that's exciting. So, I like this because I think of fermentation as magic. In the past, people saw this like magical bubbling, process, and it became the basis of myth and legend. And today, people still use fermentation's magic, but maybe in other ways. Some people use it in like magic and ritual. But for those of us who maybe don't do that, there's some other ways you can engage with fermentation as, the magic of it. Layering flavors and bringing together foods from multiple places and traditions to create your own thing. Reconnecting with the fermentation traditions of your ancestors in the past. We are at a really interesting moment where we both have a burgeoning re-interest in the kind of traditional fermentation that I teach. And on the one hand, and then on the other hand, we have fermentation, like science, like the food science in a lab growing, bespoke strains of yeast for, building whatever. And those two things exist at once. And this is the first time in history that's happened. And so it's really cool to see where that might go, right? So one part of that I want to encourage you to leave with is that with fermentation, we have an opportunity to remember that every story that we're telling counts, right? So you are actively shaping history by making this food and by recording these traditions. So we often think that our culinary traditions are going to be around forever. So, why would I write down, grandma's version of sauerkraut when like everybody on the block makes sauerkraut? Well, then guess what? 100 years later, maybe nobody's making sauerkraut and we don't know what made the sauerkraut your grandma made or whoever on the block, all the people on the block making the sauerkraut. Suddenly we don't have that knowledge at all. So many culinary traditions and dishes have been lost to time, and particularly those practiced by people whose stories were considered unimportant or dangerous. So enslaved people, indigenous communities, women, people who were, not considered important enough to record the stories of, right? When we record those traditions and we pass them on, that is a very powerful act. And it is, again, when we think about community, you're investing in the future and the resilience and creativity of your community. And so, kind of going back to the title of the book, right? Our Fermented Lives, you are an active person shaping the history of the world. You're taking these things from the past and you're bringing them forward into the future. You're connecting them with other people. Your life becomes part of Our Fermented Lives, and you're helping to shape the future of fermentation too. So that's my talk. I would love questions. Any questions, all questions welcome. And thank you again for having me.
Julia, that was incredible.
Oh, thank you.
And now I am so excited to try fermenting on my own. And I'm sure that I'm not alone in feeling that way. I'm sure that people listening in are feeling that way too. So we have a few questions in the chat that have been sprinkling in. And for people that are listening in, I encourage you to put a question in the chat and we'll have some time that we can have a question and answer session live here with Julia. Okay, our first question. Let me try that again. Okay, our first question is from Linda. Hello, should we use a particular type of water?
So this is a good question. And there's, by and large, most water you're going to use is going to be okay. I've fermented with well water. I've fermented with seawater. I mean, obviously you don't want to use water that's been contaminated or has heavy metals in it or something. People say that you should only use distilled water and that you shouldn't use tap water, but honestly, I've fermented stuff with my tap water in Atlanta for years and it's turned out, so give it a try. And if it doesn't work, then use distilled or whatever, but tap water does often work.
Great, thank you. Our next question comes from Fern. How do you decide what type of vessel to use? What needs a water seal? Is that a food safety measure?
So you basically there's two kind of very broad main types of fermentation that are going to inform a vessel. So you have aerobic, which means fermentation that needs exposure to air, and anaerobic, which does not. So it is helpful to have an airlock or whatever on your container if you want one, right? So this has, when we're talking about a water seal, which you can't see here, there's like this like moat in this particular thing, and when this little lid goes on top, it sits in that moat of water and air can't get in, but when CO2 bubbles out, it can escape. Airlocks do the same thing. So yes, it can help with safety. Is it necessary? No. It's it's up to you. I mean, it's kind of like having, a little bit of an insurance policy, but it's not, it's not the end of the world if you don't have one. Most everything I ferment does not actually have an airlock on it. As far as what type of vessel otherwise, again, if we're doing aerobic fermentation, you would want something that has some exposure to air. So I don't have an example on my little table here, but you would take, say, this jar, and instead of having this lid on it, you would have like a piece of cloth secured with a rubber band or something like that. You want to use food safe vessels. You want to use stuff that can stand up to acid. You want to use non-reactive containers, because if you're going to have acidic food in there, you don't want it eating away at at the coating on your container. But really, I mean, you can use all kinds of things. So it's pretty broad range.
Great. Next, we have a comment from Blanca, and next a question. Domas, yum fermented as well.
Yes, dolmas are fermented. I assume she means or they mean the rice. God, was it rice and lentil ones? But yes, very good.
And then Blanca also asks, can you reuse pickling juice?
Yes. You sure can. You might notice after a few reuses that the salinity is different, and you can just, if you need to add a little more salt or vinegar or spices or whatever, you can. The nice thing about reusing fermentation brine is that you already have the microbes going. So perpetual brine ferments, like Poutsai, which is a Sichuan ferment, are a good place to look if you're curious about seeing that in action.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to pop in with a question that I have.
Yes.
So I don't have the ability to type it in the chat, but I'm just going to say it out loud.
Yeah.
Your book really covers a wide range of fermented foods across different cultures. How did you go about researching and gathering information on these diverse fermentation practices?
So this book I started writing it pre-COVID, but most of it was written during lockdown, and so my initial plan was I'm going to go to all these archives and I'm going to go visit all these places. Oh no. So my PhD is in library science, and that served me very well here because I was able.
Oh, it looks like Julia's internet froze. Hopefully she'll be back shortly. I just wanted to pop in and say thank you for being here. And again, we do have a few more. Oh, I'm sorry. Your internet froze briefly.
Oh.
So we missed the last. Can you just repeat your final thought?
Yes. Sorry about that.
Okay, it looks like Julia dropped for a bit, but hopefully she'll be back soon. Here she is. Hi, welcome back. If you have questions for Julia, please feel free to put those in the chat. And then... Hello, there you are.
Can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Okay. Great. Sorry, our internet goes out often.
You're not alone, certainly. Okay, I think we're ready for our next question.
All right.
This one's coming from Sydney, and she asks, how did you find your way to the fascinating world of fermentation?
So I started fermenting food regularly when I lived in Iowa almost 20 years ago. I was pretty broke.
Thanks for your patience, everyone. While we're waiting, how many of you have tried fermenting at home? Maybe you could put in the chat your favorite thing that you've fermented on your own.
Hi.
Hi.
Okay. Did you catch that? Basically, 20 years ago, I started gardening and I had extra food.
That's
I don't know what
great.
is going on with my internet. I'm so sorry.
That's okay. And that's when you were living in Iowa, right?
Correct. Yeah, in Iowa
And
City.
Seed Savers Exchange is located in Iowa. Okay, our next question is from Fern. Any tips for getting into eating ferments? I love them, but my mom has some trouble digesting fermented things, so she avoids them. Any beginner-friendly recipe ideas that are easy on the gut?
So, I mean, I would say this would be a really
So it seems like we're frozen again.
okay.
Okay, yeah, why don't you try turning off your video? Yes. Maybe that will help. So
yes.
Yeah, so fermented foods that are easy on the gut.
Yes. So, okay, hopefully this will work with my camera off now. I would recommend starting small, using just a little bit as a condiment at a time, rather than trying to add a bunch of stuff at once. And experimenting and seeing what you like and what you tolerate well, or what your mom likes and tolerates well, are good good ways to start. You know, your doctor or dietitian might have other ideas, but those, you know, I think just introducing it a little bit at a time, you know, and even, you know, things like sauerkraut and yogurt. I mean, you don't have to eat anything too, you know, unfamiliar or whatever. It can just be, you know, everyday foods.
I share this question from Jamie. Such great information. Thank you. And I'm curious, what are you drinking?
I am drinking a glass of water that has mugwort in it. I have a bunch of mugwort in my yard, and I stuck some in this jar and decided to, yeah, have it in my water today. So here we are.
That's great. I want to share a warm comment from Wendy. Julia, so appreciated the comments about respect for food and food growers and using fermentation to use up that food that might go to waste. That was very meaningful and a take on fermentation that I hadn't thought about.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's a realization I had about, I mean, I'm not the first person to have had it about fermentation, but when I did have it about fermentation, it deepened my love of that practice so much. So I'm glad that resonated with you as well.
I asked the audience to share, what are you fermenting, or what's your favorite thing to ferment? And Teresa likes to ferment pickles and red onions.
Awesome.
Blanca loves sourdough.
Wonderful.
Sydney grew way too many beautiful cabbages last year and made some sauerkraut. And she likes to eat Blanca's sourdough. Delicious.
Wonderful.
Fern has a comment. I have a favorite water kefir I buy that's a seasonal item, so I try to extend the seasonality by using it as a culture. I haven't been able to sustain one long term yet, though. It always ends up going sour for some reason. That's interesting, Fern.
Yeah, that is interesting. I have not made water kefir or typicos. I don't have it. I've made it, but I haven't made it a ton. I'm not sure why it would go sour. My guess is something that you're adding some lactic acid bacteria in there. Yeah, it might be worth getting some new grains and just, you know, giving it a try again. But yeah, I like the idea of using it as a starter culture as well.
Fern again, I'm feeling inspired to go use the rest of my cucumbers for some quick pickles before they go off. Thank you.
Amazing. Yes.
Good luck, Fern.
Good.
Next, Tamara says, I pickled 3 dozen jars of pickles last summer. Way too many cucumbers. What a great problem to have.
That is a great problem to have. I wonder if it would be helpful for people for me to give a couple ideas for how to keep your cucumber pickles from going mushy, if that would be useful.
Oh, please do. We all want to know that. Yes.
So when you're fermenting cucumbers in particular, less so when you quick pickle them, but when you ferment them, especially in hot climates like here in Georgia, they can kind of get mushy. And so there's a couple things you can do. One is to cut off the blossom end, which is where a lot of the enzymes that would cause that softening are. And then also just ferment them just until they start to change color and then put them in the fridge. Like, don't let them go as long as you would in winter. And between those two things, you usually end up with fermented pickles that stay crisp. Oh, and add tannins to your brine too. So tea or grape leaves. That's why grape leaves are often in pickle brine, is because they add tannins to it.
That's fascinating. I'm new to pickling, so I'm glad that you mentioned that. Can you recommend a good course for kombucha SCOBY?
So there's probably somebody in your community who has one that you could ask. Barring that, if you get unpasteurized kombucha, especially from like a local producer, you can grow your own SCOBY by adding that tea to, like just letting it sit out and then adding a little more sugar and tea and water, or sweetened tea, like not all 3 of those things individually, but you can do that. I think you can order them online from some places. I mean, mine, I started, 15 or 20 years ago out of a bottle of kombucha I bought at the Iowa City Co-op. So like, and it's still kicking around. So that would be my recommendation.
That's great. From Jess, I grew up making sauerkraut with my grandma. Sauerkraut still has a special place in my heart, but I love experimenting and trying new ferments. Thanks for sharing, Jess.
Yeah, that's lovely. Yeah, I love sauerkraut.
I have a follow-up question from Fern about using the grape leaves. Could you use wild grape leaves? They're all over the woods near me, but I would guess may add extra wild yeast to your brew.
Yep. You can use wild grape leaves. I mean, I also know people who use oak leaves. I mean, just kind of whatever edible tannic leaf catches your eye, you can put it in there. And yes, they will. I mean, the nice thing about these microbes is that they're on everything, right? So like, yes, it's going to add extra wild yeast and stuff, but so is the garlic you're going to put in, and so is the fresh dill or whatever. So I wouldn't worry about that. As everything is already covered in wild microbes.
And more is more, right?
Yeah.
Julia, is there anything that has not been asked that has come to the top of mind that you'd like to share before we wrap up?
I mean, I guess just an encouragement for folks to experiment, that this is something that people have done for generations and generations, and that you can get all this high-tech fancy airlocks and whatever, but really, people have been fermenting food without that specialty equipment for thousands of years. So really just give it a try. Vegetable fermentation in particular is super duper safe. Yeah, just give it a shot and like let yourself experiment and play and learn. And even if it doesn't turn out well or you don't love the flavor, you still learned something. So there's nothing to lose.
I think that's great advice. Awesome. Julia Skinner, thank you so much for joining us today. Thanks to our audience for being so engaged and for sharing questions and comments. Thanks again to our sponsor, Rancho Gordo. Up next is called Costa Rican Heirlooms with Gabriel Bravo, starting at 2:30 Central Time. So I hope everyone gets a chance to stretch. Feel free to check out our lobby area and post comments to connect with others on the platform today. And Julia, just thanks again.
Thank you so much.